Creating a time-lapse film is a great way of showing something that we cannot experience in real life: fast motion. To get the best results, it's necessary to shoot single frames instead of video. Most professional cameras can be controlled with an external intervalometer, an app, or even feature an internal time-lapse mode. An intervalometer takes a picture over a certain amount of time while leaving a pause between capturing each picture. For example, the camera will take a picture every 3 seconds over a period of 1 hour. In post-production, those single frames will be put into a sequence which results in a video. Film or video usually has 24 or 25 frames per second, but in this case, the camera has taken only 1 picture every 3 seconds. That's why the video will be much faster than real time if it is being played back at 24 frames per second. Of course, you could also record video in real time and just speed it up in the editing software, but there are a few downsides to that. The quality of photographs captured with a DSLR or a mirrorless camera is usually better than the video quality. The advantage of using stills instead of video is also the resolution. A lot of DSLRs can only record 1080p video and don't deliver the sharpest or most detailed video footage. But the photo mode usually captures resolution higher than 4K. Even if your camera can record Ultra HD or True 4K, the bitrate and sharpness are lower compared to the raw pictures taken with the same camera model. To avoid spending too much time in post-production, it is important to shoot manually. When shooting architecture or landscape, it makes sense to close the aperture to avoid something being out of focus that shouldn't be. That obviously depends on the size of the camera sensor, but for most daylight situations, it doesn't make sense to shoot wide open, for example at f1.4, but instead at f8. Depending on where and what you are capturing, it is also best to keep the shutter speed between 1/50 of a second and 1/200th of a second in daylight to avoid a stutter effect. If things are moving fast and there is no motion blur, the results often distract because it is not smooth. The only reason to shoot at a faster shutter speed is if there is so much motion that the shot would be blurry if shooting at a slower shutter speed. Fake motion blur can also be added in post to get rid of the stutter effect, but rendering that effect can take a long time. When capturing real-time video, for example, at 24 or 25 frames per second, the shutter speed should be 1/50 of a second to make it look normal for the human eye. Another advantage of shooting a time-lapse in photo mode is long exposure, which is great for night time-lapses. You can shoot at a low ISO to keep your noise down, while also closing the aperture to get a crisp image in which most of the scene is in focus. To achieve that, you need to expose for a few seconds to be able to capture more light. Exposing long is not just a technical way of getting more light into your camera, but also to create a blurry effect when objects are moving, most commonly used when cars are driving. The car is not necessarily visible, but the front or back lights that are moving. There is no rule of how long you should expose. It always depends on how fast things are moving and how long the time-lapse should be. Exposing for 2 seconds can look great, as well as exposing for 30 seconds. It's a creative choice. There is no right or wrong. Shooting low light or nighttime lapses is definitely more challenging than shooting in daylight, but the results are usually amazing. The interval between each shot should be as short as possible to avoid missing anything interesting, because the camera is exposing for a few seconds each picture. It is always better to shoot more than to not have enough footage, or in this case, pictures. The most important thing is to make sure the camera is super stable and doesn't move. Otherwise, the shots won't be really sharp because the camera is exposing for a couple of seconds. The longer it exposes, the higher the chances are that the image will be blurry. Especially wind can cause the camera to move, even if it's just a tiny bit. That's why it makes sense to use a heavy and stable tripod head with strong legs. While shooting time-lapses doesn't require a lot of gear, you can certainly make more dramatic and interesting looking shots by adding movement. For example, by using a motorized slider or a pan and tilt head. The big difference between time-lapse motors and real-time gear is that the motor will only move when the camera is not capturing. If you are using a slider, it will only move between shots to avoid shakiness or blurry shots, which is necessary when exposing long, especially at night. One of the most important things is to run a few tests before you finally start shooting each time-lapse. Checking the weather and the sun or moonlight and reacting to that can save a shot before you even start unpacking your gear. Also, try different angles and focal lengths. It's easy to use a wide-angle lens for every shot because pretty much everything looks cool when being captured really wide. But the variety is what makes time-lapsing so interesting. Capturing something with a telephoto lens can be a bit challenging because you have to decide how exactly the final framing is going to be like, knowing that there is not much you can change in post regarding the framing. But shots with a long focal length can be gorgeous, especially when capturing something from above. The post-production is where it all comes together. Depending on the camera's file format, the first thing to do is edit the photographs. When color correcting the RAW files with software like Camera Raw or Lightroom, you can adjust all the settings. Changing the color temperature and adjusting the white balance is often useful, especially for night shots, to avoid the photos from being too warm or too cold. Saturation, sharpness, contrast, etc. can also be adjusted. After that, you can either directly open the files in Adobe After Effects, or if the RAW format is not supported, you can save them as JPEG, TIFF or DNG files. The process of color correcting and converting all the files on their original resolution can take some time, but in the end it's worth it. When opening the files in After Effects, make sure to import them as a sequence so the files are in the right order and are being played back as video. When creating a new composition, it's important to choose the right resolution. 4K or Ultra HD is common, which has a 16:9 aspect ratio just like Full HD. To get a more cinematic look, you can select 24 frames per second. 25p is usually used in Europe for television, while 30p and 24p is the standard in the US and some Asian countries. The more pictures you have per second, the shorter will be the time-lapse clip. Now for the first time you can see how well the time-lapse clip turned out. A typical problem is that the sequence is not really steady and looks shaky. To fix that issue, you can use a stabilization tool like the warp stabilizer that automatically analyzes the clip. It corrects the shakiness and zooms in a bit depending on how much stabilization is needed. Another common problem is the change of light between each photograph. That often results in flickering, which means one picture is darker or brighter than the previous or next one. Deflicker plugins can make a smooth transition so the flickering is not visible anymore, or at least minimized. To avoid an extreme digital look, we grade the color corrected files directly in After Effects to give it a more filmic look. If you want to work with the highest resolution, make sure to create a composition that has the same resolution as the photographs. You should apply the warp stabilizer before bringing together all the shots in the final 4K or Ultra HD timeline to avoid any loss in resolution and quality. Another advantage of the high 5K or even 6K resolution is that you can change the framing. You can adjust the center and zoom in if needed. That leaves a huge part of the image unseen when putting it into a 16:9 timeline. That gives you even more space to play around and adjust the framing. A great way to add some additional moving is by setting keyframes. Zooming in or out is possible, as well as sliding the image up and down, as well as moving the image to the left or right. It is important that you do that with the original high-resolution files, or you will scale up the Ultra HD footage. In case you don't want to crop the image or change the framing, then you can directly start working in an Ultra HD 16:9 timeline. Our time-lapse film Frankfurt Moving has a cinema scope aspect ratio of 2.35:1, which allowed us to play around with the framing even more. The film was captured with DSLRs in 5K resolution and mastered in Ultra HD resolution using Adobe After Effects and Premiere Pro. The idea was to showcase the variety of the city and architecture. We combined normal tripod shots with tracking shots that were captured with a slider, as well as a pan and tilt head, to be able to show more of a location in one shot. Time-lapse filmmaking has no clear rules and requires the photographer to try out a lot and be creative. The challenge of shooting time-lapses is that you don't know what you will get. The first time you see the result is when editing.